the longest siege in history. Close your eyes and picture a city by the sea. A city where the waves arrive gently every morning, touching the stone walls as if nothing in the world is wrong. The air is calm, the streets are alive. Fishermen prepare their boats. Children walk through narrow alleys echoing with footsteps that have repeated for centuries. At first glance, nothing unusual exists here. But history is never what it first appears to be. Because this city is not free. It is surrounded, not for a day, not for a month, not even for a year, but for something almost impossible to imagine. 21 long years. There are wars in history that begin with thunder and end with silence. But this story begins differently. It begins slowly, like a door that is quietly closed and then never opens again. In the mid-1600s, the world around the Mediterranean was not peaceful. Empires were rising, trade routes were being claimed, and every island, every port, every stretch of coastline mattered more than gold. And in the center of this silent struggle stood a single place, an island called Crete, a jewel of the sea, controlled by the Republic of Venice, a powerful maritime empire that ruled through ships, trade, and stone fortresses built across the water. But far beyond the horizon, another power was growing, stronger each year, expanding not just across land, but across entire worlds of influence. The Ottoman Empire, two great forces, two visions of power, and between them, Crete. At first there was no war, only tension, only rumors carried by merchants who traveled between ports, only whispers in crowded marketplaces of armies preparing, fleets gathering, and something inevitable approaching from the east. Inside the island, life continued. The city of Candia, modern-day Heraklion, still woke up every morning to the sound of church bells and sea winds. Walls were repaired, markets stayed open. People tried to believe that diplomacy would hold the world together just a little longer. Because that is what people always do. Before everything changes, they hope. But hope, in history, often arrives just before disruption. And in the year 1648, the silence finally broke. Ships appeared on the horizon. Not merchant ships, not travelers, warships. The Ottoman forces had arrived, and with them, the beginning of one of the longest sieges ever recorded in human history. A siege that would not end in weeks or months or even a single generation, but would stretch forward into time itself, as if time had forgotten the city completely. At first, the city resisted easily. Candia was heavily fortified. Venetian engineers had built massive stone defenses, thick walls designed to absorb cannon fire, bastions angled to deflect attack, and supply routes hidden beneath stone corridors. The attackers expected a quick victory, but history did not follow expectations. Because Candia did not fall, it held. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and still, the city remained standing. But a siege is not only fought with weapons, it is fought with waiting, with silence, with exhaustion. Outside the walls, armies settled in for what they believed would be a short campaign. Inside the walls, life slowly adapted to something far more unnatural. A life where the horizon was no longer open sea, but enemy lines. And so the city began its long existence between two worlds. One world filled with sunlight, memory, and ordinary life, and another world where danger never left, where every sunrise meant another day of survival, and every sunset meant another night of uncertainty. Years passed, then more years, and something strange began to happen. The siege stopped feeling like an event and started becoming a way of life. Children were born who had never seen peace outside the walls. Soldiers grew older without ever leaving the battlefield, and commanders on both sides began to understand a truth no one had expected at the beginning. This was not a war that would end quickly. This was a war that would outlive expectations, plans, and even patience itself. Outside the city, empires continued to expand. Inside the city, time began to feel different, slower, heavier, almost suspended, as if the world had placed this single place into a long, quiet pause and forgotten to press play again. And this is where our story truly begins. Not with the sound of battle, but with the sound of waiting, because what happened here was not just a siege. It was something far rarer in history. A conflict so long that it became a generation. A struggle so extended that it blurred the line between war and life, and a city that endured it all for 21 years. So now, as the story unfolds, we will walk slowly through that time, not as soldiers, not as historians rushing toward conclusions, but as quiet observers, watching a city that refused to disappear, even when the world seemed ready to forget it.
Before we begin, take a moment to imagine the Mediterranean Sea nearly 400 years ago. No engines, no airplanes crossing the sky, no phones buzzing every few minutes. Just water, wind, and time. The sea stretches out in every direction, blue and calm beneath the morning sun. Gentle waves roll across its surface. Seagulls drift overhead. Wooden ships move slowly between islands, their sails full of wind. To the people living around these shores, this is simply another ordinary day. And that is exactly how history likes to hide. The biggest events often begin on the most normal mornings. In the middle of the 17th century, the Mediterranean was one of the busiest places in the world. It connected continents. It carried goods, ideas, news, and people. Every day, ships traveled from port to port carrying silk, spices, grain, wine, and countless other products. If the modern world runs on highways and airports, this world ran on water. The sea was the highway, and business was good. Merchants filled their ships with cargo and crossed hundreds of miles of open water. Sailors followed routes that had been used for generations. Captains watched the stars at night and trusted the wind during the day. Of course, trusting the wind could be risky. The wind has never signed a contract promising cooperation. Sometimes it pushed ships exactly where they wanted to go. Sometimes it seemed to have its own travel plans. Still, life moved forward. Across the Mediterranean, ports were crowded with activity. Markets opened at sunrise. Fishermen brought in their catch. Traders negotiated prices. Workers unloaded cargo from ships that had spent weeks at sea. To most people, the future looked stable. Not perfect, but stable. And stability can feel a lot like permanence. People often believe that today's world will continue tomorrow. Then history clears its throat. At this time, one of the most powerful forces in the Mediterranean was the Republic of Venice. Venice was not the largest state in Europe. It was not the richest kingdom on earth. But it had something incredibly valuable. Ships. Lots and lots of ships. Venice had built its power through trade. For centuries, Venetian merchants had crossed the sea, building connections and establishing control over important ports and islands. The Republic understood something very simple. Control the sea and you control opportunity. As a result, Venetian influence could be found across much of the eastern Mediterranean. Its flags flew above harbors. Its merchants filled marketplaces. Its ships appeared on distant horizons. To many observers, Venice looked strong and secure, and in many ways it was. But strength can create enemies, especially when valuable trade routes are involved. Because while Venice watched over its maritime empire, another great power continued to grow: the Ottoman Empire. By the 17th century, the Ottomans controlled vast territories, stretching across 3 continents. Their cities were rich, their armies were powerful, their rulers commanded enormous resources. This was not a small kingdom looking for attention. This was one of the world's great empires, and like all great empires, it had interests that sometimes overlapped with those of Venice. Now, at this point, nobody was standing on a cliff dramatically shouting, "War is coming." History is usually less dramatic than movies. Most people were busy living their lives. They had families to feed, businesses to run, fields to work, fish to catch, taxes to complain about. People have always been surprisingly consistent when it comes to complaining about taxes. Yet beneath everyday life, something was changing. Slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. Political tensions were growing, trade competition was increasing, strategic locations were becoming more important. Leaders in distant capitals studied maps and considered possibilities. Military planners reviewed defenses. Diplomats exchanged messages. Merchants listened carefully to rumors. Nothing had happened yet, but everyone understood that powerful states rarely stop competing, especially when important territory is involved. And in the Eastern Mediterranean, few places were more important than the island of Crete. Crete sat in a valuable position between major trade routes. Ships traveling through the region often passed nearby. Whoever controlled the island gained influence over a key part of the sea. Venice controlled Crete. The Ottomans noticed. You can probably see where this story is heading. But in our chapter today, nobody knows the ending. The future still feels uncertain. On the island itself, daily life continues much as it always has. Farmers work their land, merchants sell their goods, children play in streets and courtyards, church bells ring, boats arrive in port, boats leave port, the world turns, the sea remains calm. And perhaps that calmness makes what comes next even more remarkable, because wars are often imagined as sudden explosions. A battle begins, armies march, everything changes overnight, but many conflicts begin much earlier. They begin in conversations, in decisions made behind closed doors, in ambitions that slowly grow larger, in small tensions that nobody quite manages to solve. The Mediterranean of the 1640s looked peaceful from a distance. The water still sparkled beneath the sun. The ships still crossed familiar routes. The markets still welcomed customers. Yet underneath that peaceful surface, pressure was building. Not enough for ordinary people to panic, not enough for daily life to stop. Just enough to create a feeling that something was shifting, something important, like dark clouds forming far beyond the horizon, too distant to block the sunlight, too distant to hear the thunder, but slowly moving closer. And so our story begins in a world that seems calm, a world of merchants and sailors, of islands and ports, of trade routes stretching across blue water, a world that believes tomorrow will look much like today. For now, the Mediterranean remains quiet. The waves continue their endless journey. Ships continue to sail. People continue to live their ordinary lives. And somewhere beyond the horizon, events are already beginning to move. The storm has not arrived, but it is coming. And when it does, it will surround a single city for 21 long years and create one of the most extraordinary sieges in human history. But that is a story for the next chapter. For now, the sea is calm. As we leave behind the calm waters of the Mediterranean, our story begins to focus on 2 powerful neighbors, 2 empires, 2 different ways of building power. and two groups of leaders who looked at the same map and saw the same valuable pieces of land. That is usually where trouble starts. Not because anyone wakes up one morning and decides to create 21 years of problems, but because powerful states often want the same things. And unfortunately, there is only one version of most islands. In the 17th century, two major powers dominated much of the eastern Mediterranean. On one side stood Venice. On the other stood the Ottoman Empire. Both were successful. Both were wealthy. Both were ambitious. And both believed they had good reasons to expand their influence. Naturally, this meant they occasionally looked at each other the way two hungry people look at the last slice of pizza, politely at first, then less politely. Let's start with Venice. The Republic of Venice was unlike most states in Europe. It was not famous for huge armies marching across continents. Instead, Venice built its strength on trade. Its power floated on water. Venetian ships traveled across the Mediterranean, carrying goods between east and west. Merchants brought silk, spices, metals, fabrics, and countless other products through Venetian ports. Money flowed in. Influence grew. And over time, Venice built a network of islands, ports, and trading centers that stretched far beyond the city itself. The sea was its lifeline. Every important trade route mattered. Every harbor mattered. Every island mattered, because each location helped protect trade and generate wealth. For Venice, geography was business. A small island on a map might not look important, but to Venetian leaders it could be worth a fortune. Now let's look at the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans had built one of the largest and most powerful empires in the world. Their territory stretched across vast areas of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Millions of people lived under Ottoman rule. Major cities flourished. Trade networks connected distant regions. The empire was large, organized, and confident. Unlike Venice, which depended heavily on the sea, the Ottomans controlled enormous areas of land as well. But they also understood the value of maritime power. The Mediterranean was not just a body of water. It was a highway of wealth. Whoever controlled important routes could influence commerce, security, and politics throughout the region. And the Ottomans wanted that influence. Not because they were uniquely aggressive, not because they were constantly searching for conflict, but because powerful empires rarely enjoy leaving strategic advantages in someone else's hands, especially when those advantages are sitting right next door. So while Venice looked at the Mediterranean and saw trade opportunities, the Ottomans looked at the same sea and saw strategic opportunities. Different perspectives, same map. That can be a dangerous combination. At first, however, relations between the two powers were not always openly hostile. There were periods of peace, periods of cooperation, periods when merchants conducted business and diplomats exchanged messages. History is rarely divided into simple categories of friends and enemies. Most states exist somewhere in the complicated middle. One year they trade, another year they argue, the year after that they negotiate, then they argue again. Human nature has remained remarkably consistent for centuries. Still, beneath the surface, tension continued to grow. Imagine two neighbors slowly expanding their gardens. At first, there is plenty of room, no problems. Everyone is happy. But as both gardens get larger, they eventually approach the same fence line. Suddenly, every inch matters. Who owns this patch of land? Who controls that corner? Where exactly is the boundary? Questions that once seemed small become very important. That was happening in the Mediterranean. Venice and the Ottoman Empire were both strong enough to defend their interests. Neither wanted to appear weak. Neither wanted to surrender valuable territory. Neither wanted to lose influence. And so the space between them became increasingly crowded. One of the biggest points of interest was the Eastern Mediterranean. This region contained important islands, shipping routes, and military positions. Control of these locations could shape trade for decades. Among these islands, one stood out more than most: Crete. The large island sat in a strategic position between major parts of the Mediterranean world. Ships passing through the region often traveled near it. Armies understood its value. Merchants understood its value. Politicians definitely understood its value. If maps could talk, Crete would probably be exhausted from all the attention. At the time, Crete belonged to Venice. This fact did not go unnoticed. From the Ottoman perspective, the island occupied a valuable location near territory already under Ottoman influence. From the Venetian perspective, the island was one of the crown jewels of its overseas holdings. Neither side saw much reason to give up its interests. And that is where the deeper problem appeared. Sometimes conflicts become likely not because one side is completely wrong, but because both sides believe they are completely right. Venice believed it was protecting its legitimate possessions. The Ottomans believed they were securing their strategic interests. Each side could explain its position. Each side had arguments. Each side had goals. And those goals were moving closer together, like two ships heading toward the same narrow harbor. At first, nobody panics. There is still time to adjust course. There is still room to negotiate. There is still hope that things will work out peacefully. But everyone involved understands a simple reality. The distance is shrinking. Throughout the 1640s, leaders on both sides watched carefully. Reports arrived from diplomats. Military officials studied maps. Merchants listened to rumors. Government leaders considered possibilities. Nobody could predict exactly what would happen next, but many could feel the pressure increasing. The Mediterranean still looked peaceful. Ships continued their journeys. Markets remained busy. Families continued their daily lives. Most ordinary people were far more concerned with earning a living than following grand geopolitical strategies. And honestly, that was probably healthier. But in royal courts, government offices, and military headquarters, the mood was different. People were thinking ahead, calculating risks, watching rivals, preparing for possibilities. Because sometimes the beginning of a conflict is not marked by a battle. Sometimes it begins with a realization that two powers want the same thing. A realization that neither intends to step aside, and a realization that time may not solve the problem. As the years passed, that realization became harder to ignore. Venice and the Ottoman Empire were moving toward a confrontation neither side fully desired, but both increasingly expected. The sea remained calm. The ports remained busy. The diplomats continued talking. Yet underneath it all, the path ahead seemed to narrow. The collision had not happened. Not yet. But the course was already set. And soon all eyes would turn toward a single island in the Mediterranean. An island called Crete. The place where history would stop whispering and begin speaking much louder. By now, the tension between Venice and the Ottoman Empire is growing. Nothing has exploded yet. No giant battle has started. No dramatic movie trailer voice is announcing the end of the world. But both powers are paying attention to the same place. A large island, sitting peacefully in the Mediterranean Sea, an island called Crete. And if you've never looked at a map of the Eastern Mediterranean, this might seem a little strange. After all, it is just an island. A very large island, yes, but still an island. Why would two powerful empires care so much about it? Well, sometimes geography is more important than armies. And Crete had some of the best geography money could ask for. In fact, if islands could apply for jobs, Crete's resume would be extremely impressive. Excellent location, strong natural harbors, rich farmland, strategic position, centuries of experience, available immediately. It was the complete package. To understand why Crete mattered so much, let's first picture where it sits. The island stretches across the southern edge of the Aegean Sea. It lies between Europe, Asia, and Africa, almost like a bridge connecting different parts of the Mediterranean world. Ships traveling through the eastern Mediterranean often pass nearby. Trade routes cross the surrounding waters. Merchants, sailors, and travelers moved through the region constantly. This meant that Crete was not isolated. Far from it. It sat right in the middle of important maritime traffic. Imagine owning a small gas station in the middle of nowhere. Now imagine owning the only gas station located between several major cities. The second one is probably going to attract more attention. That was Crete. Its location made it valuable before anyone even stepped onto its shores. And once people arrived, the island offered even more advantages. Crete is the largest island in Greece and one of the largest islands in the entire Mediterranean. Its coastline stretches for hundreds of miles.
Mountains rise across much of the landscape. Fertile valleys support farming. Olive trees thrive in the warm climate. Vineyards produce wine. Villages and towns are scattered across the countryside. The island could support a large population. It could produce food. It could host ports. It could serve as both a trading center and a military base. For any empire interested in controlling the Eastern Mediterranean, that combination was extremely attractive. By the 17th century, Crete had already been important for thousands of years. Civilizations had lived there long before Venice or the Ottoman Empire even existed. Ancient kingdoms had risen and fallen. Merchants had crossed its shores. Armies had landed there. Empires had claimed it. The island had seen so much history that if it could talk, it would probably need several weeks to tell the whole story. And perhaps a very large cup of coffee. But in our story, Crete was under Venetian control. Officially, the Venetians called it the Kingdom of Candia. The name came from Candia, the island's capital city. Today, that city is known as Heraklion. At the time, however, Candia was one of Venice's most important overseas possessions. Venice had ruled the island for centuries. During that time, it invested heavily in administration, trade, and defense. The island became deeply connected to the Venetian world. Ships arrived regularly from Venice. Trade flowed between ports. Government officials managed local affairs. Merchants conducted business. Life continued much as it had for generations. For Venice, Crete was more than just territory. It was a key piece of its Mediterranean network. Losing it would be painful. Very painful. The kind of painful that makes leaders stare at maps for hours. The kind of painful that keeps politicians awake at night. The kind of painful that inspires long meetings where nobody agrees on anything, but everyone agrees the situation is bad. And Venice understood this very well. The Ottomans understood it too. From their perspective, Crete occupied an important position near areas already influenced or controlled by the Ottoman Empire. As Ottoman territory expanded throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, the island stood out more and more. It was large, it was wealthy, it was strategically placed, and, most importantly, it was controlled by a rival power. That last detail tended to attract attention, a lot of attention. When military planners looked at maps, they saw opportunities. When merchants looked at maps, they saw trade routes. When politicians looked at maps, they saw influence, and when all three groups looked at the same island and became interested at the same time, things usually became complicated. Yet for now, Crete itself remained peaceful. The island's farmers continued their work. Fishermen sailed into coastal waters. Merchants sold goods in busy markets. Church bells echoed through towns. Children played in village streets. Ordinary people lived ordinary lives. Many probably had little interest in the grand strategic calculations being discussed in distant capitals. History often works this way. While leaders think about borders and influence, most people are focused on daily life. They worry about weather, harvests, family matters, business, the practical things that fill a normal day. And on Crete, normal life continued, at least for the moment. But the island's value made it impossible to ignore. Every year, its strategic importance seemed to grow. Every year, the Mediterranean became more competitive. Every year, powerful leaders looked at maps and noticed the same thing. Crete sat in an incredibly useful position. A position that could help control trade routes. A position that could support military operations. A position that could influence events across the region. In other words, it was exactly the kind of place empires wanted. And unfortunately, when two empires want the same place, the island itself rarely gets a vote. As the years passed, Crete became more than just another possession. It became the center of attention, the jewel of the sea. A prized island watched carefully by both Venice and the Ottoman Empire. Its ports remained busy, its fields remained productive, its cities remained active. Yet beneath that peaceful surface, pressure continued to build. Because geography had given Crete many gifts: beauty, resources, opportunity, strategic importance. But geography had also given it a challenge. It sat in exactly the right place to become the focus of a great struggle. And soon, that struggle would arrive. The calm waters surrounding the island would not remain calm forever. The maps being studied in distant palaces would become military plans. The discussions would become decisions. And Crete, the jewel of the sea, would move from the center of attention to the center of history.
But that is for the next chapter. For now, the island still rests beneath the Mediterranean sun, peaceful, valuable, and unaware of the storm moving slowly toward its shores. By the middle of the 17th century, Crete was still peaceful, at least on the surface. The markets were open, the farms were productive. Ships arrived in port almost every day. The bells of churches echoed through city streets. Children chased each other through dusty roads and narrow alleys. Fishermen sailed out before sunrise and returned with the day's catch. Life continued. And for most people living on the island, that was exactly how they wanted it. Nobody wakes up hoping to become part of a famous historical event. People usually prefer quiet days, days that are predictable, days where the biggest problem is a broken cartwheel or a stubborn donkey refusing to cooperate. To be fair, stubborn donkeys have probably caused more daily frustration throughout history than many kings. On Crete, ordinary life moved forward one day at a time. The island had been under Venetian rule for centuries, and many people had grown used to the routines of life there. Merchants opened their shops each morning. Farmers worked the fields. Craftsmen built furniture, repaired tools, and created goods for local markets. Families gathered for meals. Neighbors exchanged news. The rhythm of daily life rarely changed. And in the center of this world stood Candia, the capital city of the island, modern-day Heraklion. Candia was the heart of Venetian Crete. It was a busy port city where ships came and went throughout the year. Goods arrived from Venice. Products from Crete traveled to distant markets. Sailors from different lands crossed paths along its streets. The city was alive with activity. Walk through its markets, and you would hear several languages being spoken. Walk along the harbor, and you would see ships loading cargo beneath the Mediterranean sun. Walk through the residential neighborhoods, and you would find people living lives that felt surprisingly familiar. Parents worrying about their children. Children trying very hard not to worry about anything at all. business owners hoping for good customers, workers hoping for fair pay. Some things never change. Yet there was something unusual about Candia, something visitors noticed immediately. The walls. Huge stone walls surrounded the city. Massive fortifications stretched around its perimeter. Strong bastions stood at key positions. Defensive structures dominated the landscape. This was not an ordinary town. It was one of the strongest fortified cities in the Mediterranean. The Venetians had invested enormous amounts of time, money, and effort into its defenses. Engineers designed walls capable of resisting modern artillery. Builders reinforced weak points. Military planners constantly reviewed improvements. Every stone served a purpose. Every angle had been carefully considered. Looking at the walls, a visitor might wonder why such defenses were necessary. The answer was simple. Because Venice understood the value of Crete. And valuable places tend to attract unwanted attention. The leaders of Venice hoped these defenses would never face a major test. But they believed it was better to prepare in advance. History had taught them a useful lesson. Hope for peace. Prepare for problems. That approach might not sound very exciting, but it has probably saved a lot of headaches over the centuries. So while everyday life continued normally, work on the island's defenses never completely stopped. Repairs were made. Supplies were stored. Officials monitored developments around the Mediterranean. Reports arrived from diplomats and merchants. Information flowed constantly. Nothing seemed urgent, not yet. But people in positions of power rarely ignored potential threats, especially when dealing with rival empires. Far away, the Ottoman Empire continued to grow stronger. Its territory expanded. Its influence increased. Its resources remained vast. This reality was not a secret. Everyone knew it. Merchants knew it. Soldiers knew it. Government officials definitely knew it. The question was not whether the Ottoman Empire was powerful. The question was what it might do next, and nobody could answer that with certainty. For ordinary citizens on Crete, however, these questions often felt distant. Most people were focused on immediate concerns. Would the harvest be good? Would business improve? Would the weather cooperate? Would their children grow up healthy? Daily life leaves little room for endless geopolitical analysis. And honestly, most people preferred it that way. The average citizen of Candia probably spent far more time thinking about dinner than international strategy. That was perfectly normal.
Yet occasionally, rumors drifted through the city. News traveled across the Mediterranean on merchant ships. Stories arrived from distant ports. Conversations spread through markets and taverns. People talked. People always talk. Sometimes the rumors were accurate. Sometimes they were wildly wrong. History's version of social media existed long before the internet. The only difference was that misinformation traveled by ship instead of Wi-Fi. Some reports suggested increasing tension between Venice and the Ottoman Empire. Others predicted conflict. Still others insisted everything would remain peaceful. Nobody knew for sure. And so life continued. Years passed. The city remained busy. The countryside remained productive. The sea remained full of commerce. The island seemed secure, at least most of the time. Yet, the presence of those giant walls told a different story. The walls represented caution, preparation, a quiet understanding that peace can be temporary. That understanding existed throughout history. People often build defenses, not because war is happening today, but because they fear what tomorrow might bring. Candia's fortifications stood as a reminder of that reality. Most days, the walls seemed unnecessary. Children played near them. Merchants walked beside them. Citizens barely noticed them anymore. The walls became part of the background, like mountains or trees or old buildings people pass every day without thinking. But one day, those walls would become the most important structures on the island. No one knew it yet. That is what makes this period so interesting. We know what is coming. The people living there did not. They could not see the future. They could not know that their peaceful routines would soon be tested by one of the longest sieges in history. For now, life felt stable. The markets remained crowded. The harbor remained active. Families continued planning for the future. Young people married. Children were born. Businesses expanded. People laughed. People argued. People lived. And that normal life is important to remember, because when historians talk about wars, they often focus on battles, generals, and political decisions. But before every war, there is peace. Before every siege, there is ordinary life. And before every great historical struggle, there are countless people simply trying to enjoy another day. That was Crete in the years before the storm. A place of busy markets and strong walls, a place of trade and opportunity, a place where people looked toward the future with hope. Yet beneath that peaceful surface, pressure continued to build. The island remained calm, the city remained secure, but the balance was fragile, like a glass resting on the edge of a table. Still standing, still steady, but not quite as safe as it appears. And somewhere beyond the horizon, events were beginning to move faster. The peace would not last forever. Soon, rumors would become reality. Soon, preparation would become necessity. Soon, the great walls of Candia would face the challenge they had been built to withstand. But for now, the city sleeps peacefully beneath the Mediterranean sky, unaware that history is already sailing toward its shores. For years, Crete had enjoyed a fragile peace. The markets remained busy. Ships continued to enter and leave the harbor. Farmers worked their fields beneath the warm Mediterranean sun. The great walls of Candia stood quietly in the background, watching over the city like old guardians who hoped they would never have to do any actual guarding. Life felt normal, comfortably normal, but history has a habit of changing direction long before most people notice. And by the 1640s, small signs were beginning to appear. Nothing dramatic. No giant fleet on the horizon. No army marching toward the city gates. Just whispers, rumors, questions. The sort of things that spread quietly from person to person. The sort of things that make people pause for a moment before continuing with their day. At first, the rumors arrived on ships. Merchants sailing through the Mediterranean brought stories from distant ports. Some claimed that Ottoman military activity was increasing. Others spoke of new preparations. Others claimed that large numbers of troops were gathering in different parts of the empire. Nobody knew exactly what was happening, and nobody could agree on what it meant. This, of course, is how rumors usually work. One sailor says he heard something from another sailor, who heard it from a merchant, who heard it from a government official, who may or may not have heard it from someone reliable. By the time the story reaches the local marketplace, nobody can remember where it started. Yet the rumors continued, and they kept returning. That was what made them different. Normally, strange stories appeared and disappeared. These stories stayed. Again and again, reports arrived suggesting that something larger might be happening. Merchants noticed it. Officials noticed it. Military commanders definitely noticed it. Even ordinary citizens began hearing the same questions repeated. Was the Ottoman Empire preparing for war? Was Crete a target? Would peace continue? Or was something changing beneath the surface? No one had clear answers, but uncertainty itself can be powerful. A question can sometimes create as much tension as an answer. Meanwhile, far from Crete, the Ottoman Empire was indeed becoming more active. Military resources were being organized. Plans were being discussed. Leaders considered their options. The empire had many interests across its vast territory, and strategic decisions were rarely made quickly. But movement was happening, and careful observers could see it. The Mediterranean remained peaceful, yet beneath that peaceful appearance, pieces were slowly moving into position. Like a chess game where the opening moves have already begun. Most spectators may not understand what is happening. The players certainly do. In Venice, government leaders watched these developments with growing concern. Venetian officials received reports from diplomats stationed throughout the region. Messages crossed the sea. Information was collected. Meetings were held. Maps were studied. More meetings were held. History contains an incredible number of meetings. Entire empires seem to have survived on discussions about future discussions. The Venetian leadership understood one important fact. Crete was valuable, very valuable, and valuable places tend to attract attention, especially from powerful neighbors. The possibility of conflict could not be ignored, but Venice also understood something else. War was expensive, extremely expensive. Armies cost money, ships cost money, defenses cost money. Even preparing for war cost money. In fact, governments throughout history have discovered that almost everything eventually costs money. So Venice hoped that diplomacy could solve the problem. Diplomacy is often less exciting than warfare. It rarely appears in dramatic paintings. Nobody writes songs about successful negotiations nearly as often. But diplomacy has one major advantage. Far fewer people get hurt. And so, Venetian officials continued talking. Diplomats exchanged messages. Representatives met with counterparts. Efforts were made to maintain stability. The hope was simple. Perhaps the growing tension could be managed. Perhaps peace could continue. Perhaps all these rumors would amount to nothing. It was not an unreasonable hope. Many conflicts throughout history have been avoided through careful diplomacy. Unfortunately, not all of them. While political leaders exchanged messages, practical preparations also began. Venice started paying closer attention to Crete's defenses. Military officials reviewed supplies. Fortifications were inspected. Repairs were completed. Stockpiles were examined. Commanders considered what might be needed if circumstances worsened. Nothing was done openly enough to create panic. The goal was preparation, not alarm. After all, nobody wanted citizens running through the streets, shouting that the end was near. Partly because it would cause chaos, and partly because nobody actually knew what was coming. Still, the city of Candia began to feel slightly different. Not dramatically different, just enough to notice. A few more soldiers here, a few more inspections there, a little more attention given to the walls, a little more concern in official conversations. The kind of changes people notice without fully understanding. The atmosphere remained calm, yet the calmness felt less certain, like a clear sky before a storm. The sun is still shining, the weather is still pleasant, but something in the air feels different. People living through these moments rarely realize they are standing at the edge of history. For most citizens of Crete, life continued much as before. Markets remained busy. Children continued playing, merchants continued trading, ships continued arriving. People still worried about ordinary problems. A difficult customer, a poor harvest, a broken tool. Life's daily concerns remained unchanged. Yet occasionally, someone would mention the latest rumor. Someone would discuss reports from another port. Someone would wonder whether trouble was coming. The conversation would last a few minutes. Then everyone would return to work, because daily life has a remarkable ability to continue, even when uncertainty grows. As the years moved forward, however, the rumors became harder to ignore. More reports arrived, more questions emerged, more signs pointed toward a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. The great powers of the Mediterranean were watching each other carefully. Venice hoped diplomacy would succeed. The Ottoman Empire continued its preparations. Neither side openly rushed toward war, yet neither side stepped away from the growing tension. The distance between peace and conflict slowly became smaller. Day by day, month by month, conversation by conversation. And all the while, the island of Crete remained in the middle, waiting, watching, living its ordinary life beneath extraordinary circumstances. The sea was still calm, the markets were still full, the city walls still stood strong, but the shadows were growing longer, not enough to darken the world. Not yet, just enough to remind everyone that peace can be fragile. And somewhere beyond the horizon, beyond the sight of Candia's watchtowers, events were moving closer. The whispers would soon become certainty. The rumors would soon become reality. And the long siege that would make history was drawing nearer with every passing day. For years, Crete had lived with tension building quietly in the background. Rumors, preparations, and distant movements had slowly shaped the mood of the island. But in 1648, everything finally stopped being maybe and became days now. The calm Mediterranean horizon changed first. Ships appeared near Crete that did not belong to traders or travelers. These were warships, heavy, organized, and moving with purpose. People along the coast noticed it immediately, even if they did not fully understand what it meant yet. Something big had arrived. The Ottoman forces had landed on Crete. At first, there was no loud chaos, no dramatic explosion of events, just movement, controlled, steady, and serious. Troops began to disembark and spread across key areas of the island. Their goal was not confusion. Their goal was control. And slowly, the situation began to close in around Candia. Candia, the main fortified city of Crete, was the heart of Venetian power on the island. It was strong, heavily built, and surrounded by massive defensive walls. For years, it had been prepared for a moment like this, even if everyone secretly hoped that moment would never come. But hope and reality do not always match. The Ottoman forces did not rush. That was important. This was not a quick raid or a short battle. This was something larger. They began to position themselves carefully around the city, cutting off movement routes and securing important ground. Step by step, the space around Candia started shrinking. At first, many inside the city still believed things might pass quickly. That is a natural reaction. When danger first arrives, the mind often says, maybe it will be over soon. People continue their routines, holding on to normal life as long as possible. But outside, the pattern was different. More troops arrived, more positions were secured, more areas were blocked. The circle around the city slowly tightened, like a rope being pulled from multiple sides at once, and then it became clear. This was not temporary. Venice reacted quickly once the news reached them. Messages were sent across the sea. Orders were issued. Ships were prepared. The Venetian navy began adjusting its movements to respond to the situation unfolding in Crete. Candia was no longer just a city. It had become a strategic center in a growing conflict. Still, even as military actions increased, life inside the city did not collapse immediately. That is something history often forgets. Even during early stages of war, people continued to live. Shops opened, bread was baked, markets still functioned. Children still played in the streets, although maybe a bit closer to home than before. Life has a strange habit of continuing, even when it probably shouldn't. But the atmosphere was changing, slowly, quietly, like a room where someone has just turned down the light without telling anyone. Outside the walls, Ottoman forces continued organizing their positions. They built camps, secured supply routes, and strengthened their hold around the city. This was not a rushed attack. It was structured, patient, almost careful. Every move seemed calculated. Every position had a purpose. Inside Candia, Venetian commanders worked just as carefully. Cannons were checked, walls were inspected, soldiers were assigned positions, supplies were counted and stored. Everything that could be prepared was prepared. The city was getting ready, even if it did not yet feel like full war. Emotionally, things were shifting too. People began to notice small changes in their daily lives. Movement outside the walls became more restricted. Travel became riskier. Conversations became more serious. Even silence felt heavier than before. The sea, once a symbol of freedom and connection, now felt different. It no longer felt like an open path. It felt like a boundary, and not a friendly one. Still, the siege did not fully explode into chaos. It settled into something slower, a pattern of waiting, watching, and preparing. Both sides understood this would not end quickly. Time itself was becoming part of the conflict. This is where the historical moment truly begins to take shape. Siege of Candia. Not with a single dramatic moment, but with movement, positioning, and the quiet closing of space around a city that once felt open and secure. In these early days, nobody yet understood how long this would last. There was no way to know that this would become one of the longest sieges in recorded history. There was only the present moment and the pressure building inside it. Inside Candia, awareness slowly replaced calm. Not panic, just awareness. People became more careful in how they moved. They listened more closely to sounds near the walls. They watched the horizon more often. Life continued, but it no longer felt untouched. Outside the city, the Ottoman forces held their positions firmly. They were not in a hurry. Time was not their enemy yet. They were building something that required patience. Inside the city, Venice understood something important too. Holding Candia would not be easy. Distance was a problem. Reinforcements had to travel across long stretches of sea. Every ship mattered. Every delay mattered. In war, time is never just time. It becomes pressure, and pressure builds on both sides. Still, this was only the beginning. No final battles, no final outcomes. Just the opening stage of something far larger than anyone had first expected. A city now surrounded. An island now caught in a slow, tightening struggle. And two great powers, each convinced they could manage the situation, now locked into a conflict that would stretch far beyond normal expectations. The Mediterranean remained calm on the surface. But around Candia, everything had changed. The first attack had not just started a siege, it had started a long chapter of history that would test patience, endurance, and time itself. And as the sun set over the island that evening, one truth became quietly clear. This was not going to end quickly. When people think about sieges, they often imagine constant battles, explosions, and non-stop chaos. But reality is usually slower, more patient, more repetitive, and in Candia, life quickly became a routine of survival. The city did not fall, not fast, not slow, not at all in the way attackers expected. The massive Venetian walls around Candia stood firm, thick stone, carefully designed angles, layered defenses, built not in a rush but over many years with one purpose in mind: hold the city no matter what comes. And for now they were doing exactly that. Holding. Outside the walls, the Ottoman forces continued their positions, but the city remained intact. No sudden breakthrough, no quick victory, just a steady, grinding pressure that stretched days into weeks. Inside the city, life slowly adjusted. At first, people hoped this situation would end soon. That is always the first reaction. A kind of mental delay. Like when you hear bad news and your brain politely says, "Let's wait and see." So life continued almost normally. Shops stayed open, people walked the streets. Children still played, though often closer to home. But slowly, small changes started to appear. Food began to be managed more carefully. Supplies were checked more often. Markets became more controlled. Nothing dramatic, just small reminders that things were not normal anymore. Rationing became part of daily conversation. Not in a panic way, but in a practical way. How much grain do we have left? Did the ship bring salt this week? Is bread going to be smaller again? Simple questions. Important questions. Questions that slowly start to define daily life. And like most long situations in history, people adapted. Humans are very good at adapting, sometimes too good. Even in difficult conditions, routines form quickly. In Candia, people began organizing their days around what was available, rather than what was ideal. Meals became simpler. Work became more focused. Movement became more careful. The city was learning how to live inside pressure. Outside the walls, the siege structure remained steady. Camps stayed in place. Positions were reinforced. Supplies were managed. The attackers were not rushing. This was not a storm that passed quickly. It was something slow and persistent. like a heavy weight resting on the city and refusing to move. Inside the walls, Venetian commanders worked constantly. Repairs were ordered. Watch schedules were adjusted. Walls were inspected again and again. If something could be strengthened, it was strengthened. If something could be repaired, it was repaired. If something could be checked twice, it was checked 3 times just to be safe. Trust in stone became part of daily life. Candia's defenses were impressive. Huge bastions, deep fortifications, carefully planned structures designed to absorb cannon fire and resist long attacks. Engineers had built them with the expectation that one day they would face a serious test. That day had arrived, and so far the walls were doing their job. Still, walls alone do not win sieges. People inside the walls do, and people begin to feel pressure in different ways. Not always loudly, sometimes quietly, in the way conversations slow down, in the way people look at the horizon a little longer than usual, in the way silence becomes more noticeable. Even humor changes. Jokes become simpler, a little sharper, a little more about daily struggle. Someone might say, "At least the bread is tough enough to survive anything," and everyone laughs because what else can you do? Life inside Candia became a mix of routine and uncertainty. Markets still operated, but with limits. Goods were carefully distributed. Nothing was wasted. Every item had value now, even things people used to ignore. A small piece of rope, an extra nail, a broken bucket that could still hold water if tilted just right. Everything mattered. Nothing was ordinary anymore. Children grew up faster in environments like this. Not in a dramatic way, but in small observations. They learned to listen more carefully, to stay closer to home, to understand that adults were more serious than before. Still, children remain children. They play, they laugh, they find small moments of normal life, even when normal life is under pressure. Inside Candia, that balance continued. Outside, the siege remained steady. No major breakthrough, no collapse, just ongoing pressure that slowly shaped every part of life. Venice, far across the sea, continued sending messages and managing its response. Reinforcements were planned. Supplies were organized. The connection between the island and the mainland became more important than ever. Every ship mattered. Every delay mattered. Every report mattered. Because Candia was not just a city anymore. It was a symbol of endurance, a place where survival itself had become a daily task. And yet, despite everything, life did not stop. People still woke up each morning, still prepared food, still worked, still hoped. Hope, even in small amounts, is surprisingly persistent. It does not disappear easily. It adjusts. It shrinks when needed. But it rarely vanishes completely. Inside the city, hope took simple forms. Maybe supplies would last longer than expected. Maybe relief would arrive soon. Maybe the situation would stabilize. Maybe tomorrow would be a little easier. Not grand hopes, just small ones, and sometimes that's enough to keep a city functioning. Meanwhile, the pressure outside the walls did not disappear. It remained constant, like a presence that never fully leaves the room. Even when nothing is happening, the awareness of it stays. This is what makes long sieges so unusual in history. They are not defined only by battles. They are defined by waiting, by endurance, by the strange way life becomes divided into before and during. Candia was now firmly in the during. Every day reinforced that reality, and yet the city did not break. It adapted, it adjusted, it endured. The walls stood, the people remained, the routines continued. Slowly, carefully, life moved forward under pressure, and somewhere beyond the horizon, both sides understood a growing truth. This would not end quickly, not in weeks, not in months, maybe not even in years. But for now, Candia held on. A city under pressure, still standing, still living, still waiting for whatever would come next. If the siege of Candia on land was slow and heavy, the war at sea was something else entirely. It was quieter, but also more unpredictable. Because out on the Mediterranean, there were no walls to hide behind. No cities to protect you from every angle. Just water, wind, and ships trying very hard not to become history. By this stage of the conflict, one thing was clear. The city of Candia could not survive without the sea. It needed supplies, food, weapons, soldiers, reinforcements. And all of that had to come from across the water, from Venice. So the sea became the lifeline of the city, and naturally it also became the battlefield. The Republic of Venice understood this very well. For centuries, Venice had ruled through naval strength. Its ships were not just transport. They were power, floating pieces of strategy, moving pieces of control. If Venice could keep the sea open, Candia could survive. If it lost control of the city would slowly weaken. Simple idea. Very difficult execution. On the other side, the Ottoman Empire also understood the same truth. Control the sea routes, and you control the flow of survival. So both sides began to move their fleets more seriously. Not in one dramatic moment, but step by step, ship by ship, route by route. At first, the changes were subtle. Venetian supply ships started traveling in groups instead of alone. Convoys became more common. Escorts were added. Routes were adjusted, depending on intelligence reports and weather conditions. Basically, sailing the Mediterranean now required something like a full-time security plan, which is not exactly relaxing. Imagine planning a grocery trip, but your route might include pirates, warships, and unknown situations. That was the reality for many sailors at the time. And slowly, the Mediterranean began to feel different. The sea looked the same. Blue water, bright sun, calm waves, but underneath that calm surface, danger was moving, hidden in distance, waiting for opportunity. Soon, the first real naval clashes began. Not massive cinematic explosions like in movies, but sudden encounters. A convoy spotted on the horizon, a change in wind direction, a flag identified too late. And then tension. Always tension first, then movement, then chaos. Venetian ships tried to protect supply routes heading toward Crete. Ottoman ships attempted to block or intercept them. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes they failed. Sometimes both sides simply circled each other, tested positions, and withdrew when conditions were not favorable. War at sea is not always about dramatic victory. It is often about control, presence, pressure. Even small interruptions mattered. A single delayed supply ship could affect food levels in Candia. A blocked route could change planning for weeks. A lost convoy could create panic far from the battlefield. So every encounter mattered more than it might seem on paper. As the conflict expanded, the Mediterranean became a kind of silent battlefield. No front lines, no clear borders, just zones of influence that shifted, depending on who was stronger that week. The Republic of Venice relied heavily on its navy. Its ships were experienced, built for long voyages, and supported by centuries of maritime knowledge. Venetian sailors knew the sea like a familiar road. They understood currents, winds, coastal patterns. But even experience has limits when conditions keep changing. The Ottoman Empire, meanwhile, was also strengthening its naval presence. Its fleet was growing, its organization improving. Its ability to project power across the Mediterranean was becoming more serious each year. This created a situation where neither side could fully dominate. Instead, they competed, constantly, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, sometimes without even meeting, just missing each other by hours or miles. But always aware that the other side was out there, watching, planning, waiting. For sailors involved in this war, life became unpredictable. One day might be calm, the next day might involve sudden navigation changes, unexpected encounters, or long delays at sea while waiting for safer conditions. Even simple travel became complicated. And yet, ships kept sailing, because Candia needed them. Inside the city, people depended on what arrived by sea. Food supplies, military equipment, communication. Everything connected back to maritime routes. So every successful delivery felt like a small victory. Every arrival brought relief. Every failure brought concern. Over time, this created a strange rhythm. A cycle of waiting for ships, watching the horizon, hoping for sails to appear. And when they did, the entire city would quietly breathe a little easier. But when they didn't, silence felt heavier. The sea itself seemed to reflect this tension. On the surface, it remained beautiful, almost peaceful. But beneath that beauty was constant movement, invisible struggles, shifting control, unseen risks. This is why historians often describe this phase as a sea war. Not because of one single decisive battle, but because the entire ocean became part of the conflict. A space where power was tested again and again. Between the Republic of Venice and the Ottoman Empire, the competition at sea became just as important as the siege on land. Sometimes even more important, because without the sea, Candia would slowly weaken no matter how strong its walls were. And both sides understood this deeply, so the struggle continued. Fleet movements increased. Convoys were planned more carefully. Routes changed depending on threats. Commanders adapted constantly. There was no final solution, only ongoing effort and ongoing uncertainty. For the people on Crete, this meant something simple. Their survival was tied to something they could not control: the sea. It could bring help or delay it. It could connect them to Venice or isolate them completely. And they could only wait and watch. Up on the walls of Candia, guards often looked outward, not just for land attacks, but for ships. Because now the horizon mattered in every direction. Land was pressure, sea was survival. Both were part of the same struggle. As the naval conflict intensified, one truth became clearer with every passing month. This was not just a siege anymore. It was a full system of war. Land and sea connected, walls and waves connected, two empires connected through constant movement and resistance. The Republic of Venice pushed to keep its lifeline open. The Ottoman Empire pushed to cut it off. And between them, the Mediterranean carried the weight of both ambitions. For sailors, it was dangerous. For commanders, it was strategic. For civilians in Candia, it was life itself. And so, the sea war continued, quiet in appearance, constant in reality, unpredictable in outcome, and always moving just beyond the horizon. Because in this war, nothing stayed still for long. Not ships, not plans, not hope. Only the water remained the same, endless, and watching. At first, everyone thought the siege would be short. That is always the first thought in history. This will end soon. This cannot last long, maybe just a few months. People say it with confidence, right before reality quietly ignores them. Because in Candia, the siege did not end. It continued, day after day, month after month, year after year. And slowly, something strange began to happen. Time stopped feeling like time. It started feeling like routine. The kind of routine where you don't remember when something started anymore. You just know it is still going on. Outside the walls, the war continued to exist in the same slow rhythm. Inside the walls, life adjusted again, and again, and again. At some point, people stopped asking, "When will this end?" and started asking more practical questions. Is there enough food this week? Who is on guard tonight? Did the sea ships arrive? Simple questions, survival questions. Because when something lasts long enough, humans stop treating it like an event and start treating it like life. Candia became exactly that, a city where war was no longer a moment. It was the background, like weather or wind, always there, sometimes louder, sometimes quieter, but never fully gone. Years passed, soldiers came and went, commanders were replaced. New faces appeared on the walls where old faces used to stand. Some soldiers arrived as young men, and stayed long enough to become older men without ever leaving the siege. That kind of time does something to people. It reshapes how they think, how they talk, how they wait. Inside the city, children grew up under the same sky of uncertainty. They learned early that outside the walls meant something dangerous. Not because someone told them in a dramatic speech, but because they heard it in everyday conversations, in warnings, in cautious tones, in the way adults looked at the horizon a little longer than normal. For them, war was not a story. It was the environment they lived in. Some of those children had never seen a peaceful Crete, never experienced a world where ships arrived without fear, never known a city without guards on the walls. And yet they still played, because children always find a way to play, even in serious places. They turned narrow streets into games, turned empty spaces into imagination, turned fear into background noise they did not fully understand yet. Life adapted, as it always does. Inside Candia, everything slowly became structured around endurance. Food was managed carefully, repairs never stopped. Routines became stronger than emotion. People learned how to conserve energy, not just physical energy, mental energy too, because long waiting drains something invisible, not quickly, but deeply. Outside the city, the same long passage of time was happening. Armies changed, plans changed, weather changed, but the siege itself remained. A constant pressure point in the Mediterranean world. A conflict that refused to resolve quickly. A situation that slowly became normal for everyone involved, even for those watching from far away. And that is one of the most unusual parts of this history. The world did not explode. It slowly adjusted, like a clock ticking so long that people stop hearing it. Venice continued to support the city across the sea. The Ottoman forces continued maintaining pressure around Candia. Neither side fully stepped back. Neither side fully gave in. So, time did what time always does in long conflicts. It stretched everything. Moments became days, days became months, months became years, and years became something harder to measure. At some point, people stopped counting in small numbers. They counted in changes. This is the third commander I have seen. This is the second generation of soldiers I have served with. This is the way things have always been. That phrase is dangerous in history, because it slowly replaces memory. And memory is what usually keeps people aware of change. Without it, even extraordinary situations start to feel normal. Inside Candia, that normality took hold. Not because people forgot the war, but because they learned how to live inside it. The walls still stood strong. The sea still mattered. The supplies still arrived when they could. But the emotional feeling of siege changed over time. It became less like an emergency and more like a condition, something permanent, something ongoing, something that shaped everything without needing to announce itself every day. Outside the walls, the landscape also changed slowly. Encampments became more established, positions became more permanent, paths became worn into the ground from constant use. What began as a temporary military action had turned into a long-term presence, a system built around waiting and pressure, a balance that neither side could easily break. And so the years continued, quietly, without dramatic announcements, without clear milestones, just steady movement forward. And in the middle of all this, the people of Candia lived their lives. They still laughed sometimes, still argued sometimes, still celebrated small moments when they could. Because even in long sieges, life does not disappear. It shrinks, it adapts, but it remains. And over time, something unexpected happens. People begin to accept the impossible as normal. A generation that grew up knowing only siege life now becomes adults who see it as standard reality. For them, history is not something they read about. It is something they wake up inside every morning. And so, slowly, quietly, without anyone fully noticing the shift in real time, years turned into a decade, and the siege was still not over. The walls still stood, The sea still mattered, and the city still waited. Not for a quick ending, but for whatever time would bring next. After years of siege, something strange happens in Candia. Life does not stop, it just learns new rules. Inside the city walls, people wake up each morning not to peace and not to panic, but to something in between. A kind of controlled normal. A life that says, yes, war is happening, but we still need breakfast. And honestly, that is probably the most human thing ever. Because even in a city surrounded by conflict, daily life refuses to disappear. The streets of Candia still move with activity. Not the same activity as before the siege began, but activity nonetheless. Markets open with fewer goods, but they still open. Merchants arrange what they have left. People trade carefully, sometimes creatively. If one item is missing, they find something else to replace it. Human creativity becomes very active when supplies become inactive. Churches remain one of the most important places in the city, not just for religion, but for comfort, for silence, for routine. People gather there not only to pray, but to feel normal for a while. Inside those stone walls, the world feels slightly less complicated. Candles burn, voices echo softly. Time slows down in a different way. Outside the church, war exists. Inside, it feels far away for a few minutes. And that small distance matters. Life in Candia becomes a rhythm between two worlds, one of pressure, one of routine. People learn how to switch between them without thinking too much about it. It is almost like stepping outside in rain, then coming back inside and pretending nothing happened. Except in this case, the rain lasts for years. Still, people adapt, they always do. Markets slowly adjust to the situation. There is less variety, fewer imported goods, but trade does not stop completely. Instead, it becomes more local, more practical, more focused on survival. A sack of grain becomes more valuable than fancy cloth. A repaired tool becomes more important than a new decoration. Luxury slowly steps aside and lets necessity take the front seat. And somehow life continues. Families still gather for meals. Not always big meals, sometimes very simple ones. Bread, olives, whatever can be found. But meals still matter. Because sharing food is not just about eating. It is about staying connected. Inside homes, people try to maintain a sense of normal family life. Parents tell stories to children. Children ask questions adults do not always have good answers for. And sometimes the best answer is just a small smile and a change of topic. Because honesty in siege life can be heavy, yet even under pressure, life finds its milestones. People still fall in love, yes, even in a besieged city. Maybe, especially in a besieged city. Because when tomorrow is uncertain, today becomes more important. Couples meet, families agree, weddings happen, not always grand celebrations, sometimes small gatherings, but still meaningful. There is something powerful about choosing to celebrate life in a place surrounded by war. It is like saying, we are still here, and that message matters. Children are born during these years too. New life arriving in a city that has known long conflict, and every birth carries a strange, emotional contrast. On one hand, hope. On the other hand, uncertainty. But mostly, hope. Because life arriving in difficult times always feels like a reminder that the world has not stopped moving forward. Parents raise these children with a mix of care and caution. They teach them to stay aware of danger, but also to enjoy small moments. A game in the street. A story before sleep. A rare, peaceful afternoon. Children grow up knowing sounds that outsiders would find unusual. The distant echo of cannons. The movement of guards along the walls. The constant awareness that the city is surrounded. But to them this becomes normal background noise, like wind or waves, or that one neighbor who always talks too loudly. Even soldiers begin to change over time. Some arrive young and stay long enough to grow older without leaving the city. They develop routines inside the siege. They know which walls need more attention, which sections are quiet, which nights feel more tense than others. They talk less about victory and more about endurance, because after enough time, survival becomes its own kind of achievement. Inside Candia, humor also survives. Not loud humor, not carefree humor, but small jokes shared between people who understand the situation too well. Someone might say, "If this siege lasts longer, I will open a shop here permanently." Another replies, "Good idea. I will be your first customer in 20 years." And everyone laughs. A little. Because laughter does not disappear easily. Even under pressure, it just becomes quieter, more intentional, more valuable. The churches, markets, homes, and walls all become part of one shared rhythm. A rhythm built not on peace and not on constant conflict, but on something more complex. Endurance, everyday endurance, and the city itself becomes a living system of adaptation. Nothing is exactly as it was before the siege, but nothing has collapsed either. It exists in a strange balance, a life adjusted to long uncertainty. Outside the walls, the war continues in the distance, but inside, people focus on what they can control: their work, their families, their routines, their small choices each day, because that is how humans survive long situations. Not through big actions, but through small, repeated ones, one morning at a time, one conversation at a time, one meal at a time. Over time, this creates something powerful. A quiet resilience that does not always look dramatic from the outside, but inside the city, it is everywhere. In the way people walk, in the way they speak, in the way they continue, even when nothing is certain. Candia becomes more than just a fortified city. It becomes a place where life and conflict exist side by side, not perfectly balanced, but constantly adjusted, like two instruments playing slightly different tunes in the same room, and somehow still forming a pattern. As years pass, people begin to understand something without saying it directly. This situation may not end quickly. It may not end neatly, but life will continue regardless. And so they continue with it. Day after day, season after season, life in a besieged city becomes not just survival, but living inside survival. And in that strange space between war and normal life, Candia shows something very human. Even when surrounded, even when pressured, even when time feels stretched, life still finds a way to remain. Life.
After many years of siege, Candia was still standing. That fact alone was becoming almost legendary. A city surrounded for so long, yet still holding its ground, still functioning, still refusing to collapse. But everyone inside the conflict understood something important. Even the strongest walls need support, and Venice knew it too. Far across the sea, in the Republic of Venice, leaders were no longer treating the siege as a distant problem that might resolve itself. It had become something much larger. A long, expensive, exhausting struggle. And slowly, the decision formed. Help would be needed. Not just small help, not just symbolic support, but real reinforcements from across Europe. And so messages were sent. Requests for assistance, calls for engineers, calls for soldiers, calls for supplies. In simple terms, Venice started asking for backup. And in history, when a situation becomes serious enough, backup eventually arrives. Because Candia was no longer just a Venetian stronghold. It had become a shared concern, a symbol of resistance, a strategic point that many European powers now watched carefully. Some out of interest, some out of concern, and some simply because nobody wanted to be the one who ignored it and later said, "Oh, that got worse than expected." So slowly, reinforcements began to arrive. Ships came from different parts of Europe. Soldiers from various regions joined the defense. Engineers with experience in fortifications were brought in. Supplies were carried across long sea routes. It was not one massive arrival. It was a steady flow, a constant stream of support that changed the rhythm of the siege. Inside Candia, people noticed the difference. New uniforms appeared on the walls, new voices in command discussions, new tools and materials for construction and repair. Even the air of the city felt slightly different. Not less tense, but more active, more organized, more determined. The city was no longer only defending itself with what it already had. It was building forward,
expanding its defenses, strengthening weak points, adding new layers of protection. Walls were reinforced again, bastions were improved, artillery positions were upgraded. Engineers worked constantly, studying angles, thickness, and impact points. Candia was slowly transforming into one of the most heavily fortified cities of its time. If someone had looked at it from above, they might have thought the entire city was made of stone, steel, and preparation, and a lot of very tired people, working with very serious faces. Because engineering under siege is not glamorous work. It is constant repair, constant improvement, constant adjustment. Something breaks, it is fixed. Something weakens, it is reinforced. Something new is discovered, it is implemented immediately. There is no pause button, and yet this constant effort created something remarkable, a city that refused to give in. Venice also understood something else. Defense alone was not enough. To hold Candia, they needed expertise, not just soldiers, but knowledge. So engineers from Europe arrived with new ideas, new techniques, new methods of building and repairing fortifications under pressure. They studied the walls carefully. They examined damage patterns. They suggested improvements that could absorb more impact. They redesigned sections that needed stronger reinforcement. It was like a long conversation between stone and science. And slowly, Candia evolved. The siege was no longer just a military situation. It became a kind of international project, a complex collaboration under extreme conditions. Even soldiers from different regions began working together. At first, communication was not always smooth. Different languages, different habits, different ways of thinking. Sometimes instructions needed to be repeated more than once. Sometimes gestures spoke louder than words. But over time, a shared understanding formed. Because when people face the same pressure for long enough, cooperation becomes easier. Not perfect, but functional. Outside the city, the Ottoman forces also continued their pressure. They observed the changes carefully. They adjusted their own strategies. They reinforced their positions. They understood that Candia was becoming stronger, not weaker, and that meant the siege would not end quickly. If anything, it was becoming more complex, more layered, more costly. Both sides now faced a long-term conflict that required patience and resources in equal measure. Inside Candia, the presence of reinforcements brought something subtle but important. Confidence. Not full confidence, not certainty, but enough to keep morale from breaking, because seeing new ships arrive on the horizon meant something simple. They had not been forgotten. That feeling matters in long struggles, very much. Life inside the city continued its strange balance. Markets still operated, supported by improved logistics. Churches remained active, offering calm in uncertain times. Homes continued to function as spaces of normal life inside abnormal circumstances. And now, with reinforcements arriving, there was a sense that the city was not standing alone anymore. Even if the siege itself did not become easier, it became shared, and sharing a burden, even a heavy one, changes how it feels. Engineers worked alongside soldiers. Soldiers worked alongside civilians. Everyone had a role. Everyone contributed. Even small tasks mattered. Repairing a section of wall, transporting supplies, maintaining watch positions. No role was too small to be important, because Candia was now operating like a single, unified system of survival. As time passed, the city's defenses grew stronger, more structured, more layered, more prepared for long-term pressure. From a distance, Candia looked less like a normal city and more like a massive fortified structure built on an island. A place designed not just to live, but to resist. But even with all this reinforcement, everyone understood something quietly in the background. Strength does not end a siege. It only extends the timeline. The conflict continued. The pressure remained. The sea still mattered. The land still mattered. And both sides still waited for the other to break first. But Candia did not break. Instead, it adapted. It evolved. It held, and as reinforcements continued to arrive from Europe, one thing became increasingly clear. This was no longer just a regional conflict. It was becoming one of the most prolonged and heavily supported sieges in European history. A city under pressure, now supported by an entire continent, still standing, still waiting, and still far from its end.
After so many years, something strange begins to happen in Candia. The enemy is still there. The walls are still standing, the sea is still being fought over, but the biggest force in the siege is no longer cannons or ships, it is time.
Time itself becomes the real battlefield. Because when a siege lasts long enough, it stops being about attack and defense and starts being about endurance. On both sides, exhaustion begins to settle in like a slow fog. Not sudden, not dramatic, just constant. Day after day, week after week, year after year. Inside, Candia, the city still holds. But holding has a cost. Everything starts to feel heavier. Not just physically, mentally too. People wake up tired even after sleeping. Soldiers stand watch with tired eyes. Engineers repair walls with tired hands. Even conversations become shorter, as if everyone is saving energy without fully realizing it. Outside the city, the Ottoman forces face the same problem. Long supply lines stretch across the Mediterranean. Ships take time to arrive. Food is not always steady. Troops rotate, but not always smoothly. And slowly, the siege begins to drain everyone involved. Not through one big failure, but through thousands of small ones. A delayed shipment, a missed supply, a sickness spreading through a camp, a storm destroying stored food. Small events that, over time, become very large problems. Disease becomes one of the quiet enemies of the siege. Not loud like cannons, not visible like armies, but far more persistent. In crowded camps, illness spreads easily. On ships, conditions are harsh. In cities under pressure, sanitation becomes harder to maintain. And so, both sides suffer in ways that do not appear on battle maps. Exhaustion spreads too. Soldiers who once arrived full of energy now move slower. Not because they are weaker, but because time has taken pieces of their strength. There is a kind of tiredness that no sleep fully fixes. A deep fatigue that builds slowly over months and years. It becomes part of daily life. Inside Candia, civilians feel it just as much. The city has already adapted to siege conditions, but adaptation does not remove stress. It only makes it manageable. Food remains limited. Repairs never stop. The sense of pressure never fully disappears. Even quiet days feel temporary. Even peaceful nights feel uncertain. People begin to measure time differently, not by seasons, but by events. Before the last shipment, after the last attack, since the last repair, time becomes less like a straight line and more like a collection of moments, some good, some bad, most just tiring. Still, life continues, because it has to. Children still grow up inside the city. Some become teenagers who have never known anything except siege life. They hear stories from older people about how things used to be before the war. Sometimes they listen with curiosity, sometimes with disbelief. A peaceful world outside the walls feels almost like a myth to them, like a story told to help them sleep. Ironically, sleep is something many people struggle with, not because of fear alone, but because the mind does not easily rest when life feels uncertain for so long. Yet even in exhaustion, people find small ways to cope. Humor becomes one of them. Quiet humor, simple humor, the kind that does not try to change reality, only make it slightly lighter. A soldier might joke about counting how many times the same wall has been repaired. A merchant might joke that his goods have survived more battles than he has. Nobody laughs loudly, but they smile. And sometimes, that is enough. Outside the walls, the Ottoman and Venetian forces continue their long struggle. But even leadership begins to feel the weight of time. Plans that once seemed simple now stretch across years. Resources that once felt abundant are now carefully managed. Every decision carries more fatigue behind it. Not just physical fatigue, but decision fatigue. The exhaustion of constant planning without clear resolution. The siege no longer feels like a sharp conflict. It feels like a long process that nobody can easily stop. Like a machine that keeps running because no one knows how to turn it off safely. In both camps, replacements become necessary more often. Soldiers rotate in and out. Commanders change, but the situation remains the same. Candia still stands, and that fact alone begins to reshape expectations. At the beginning of the siege, people expected quick outcomes. Now expectations have shrunk, not because hope is gone, but because experience has changed what people believe is possible. Inside Candia, survival becomes the goal. Not victory, not expansion, just continuation. Another day, another week, another season, and over time, that becomes its own kind of success. But it is a quiet success, the kind that does not feel like celebration, only relief. Outside, the same truth slowly settles in. Winning this siege will not be quick, or easy, or clean. It will require more time than anyone originally imagined, and time is the one resource both sides are running out of. The Mediterranean itself continues to move calmly in the background. Waves still rise and fall. Ships still travel when they can. The sky still changes colors at sunset, as if nothing important is happening below. But on the ground, everything is different. Time is no longer just passing. It is being paid for, with energy, with health, with patience, with life itself, slowly spent one day at a time. And so the siege continues. Not with dramatic turning points, but with quiet suffering, with tired faces behind walls, with exhausted camps outside them, with a world slowly realizing that this conflict is no longer just about land or sea. It is about how long people can endure before something finally gives way. And in Candia, as another long day ends and the city settles into another uncertain night, one truth becomes clearer than ever. The cost of time is not measured in years alone. It is measured in everything those years take away. After more than 2 decades of siege, something changes in the air around Candia. Not slowly this time, not quietly, but with a sense of purpose that feels heavier than before. Because both sides understand something very simple now. Waiting is no longer enough. For years, the conflict had been shaped by endurance, by patience, by long stretches of time where nothing seemed to change, but everything slowly wore down. But now that phase is ending. The Ottoman forces begin preparing something different, something larger, something final. A push designed not to maintain pressure, but to break it. After so many years of slow warfare, the shift feels almost sudden, even though it has been building in the background for a long time. Inside Candia, people notice it first in small ways. The horizon feels more active. Movement increases outside the walls. Reports from watchtowers become more urgent. And then, the signs become impossible to ignore. Cannons are being positioned again. Not for small exchanges, not for warnings, but for something much bigger. The ground outside the city begins to change. New positions are built. Old positions are strengthened. Troops gather in larger numbers than usual. Even from a distance, the scale feels different. Heavier, more focused, like a long breath finally being held before a decisive action. Inside the city, Venetian commanders immediately recognize the meaning. This is not routine pressure. This is preparation for a major assault. Messages move quickly through Candia. Soldiers are ordered to their positions. Engineers check the walls once again. Supplies are redistributed. Everyone knows what is coming, even before it officially begins. The final push has started to form, and then, after years of relative quiet and large-scale bombardment, the cannons return. At first, the sound is distant, a deep rumble on the horizon, then closer, then continuous. The silence that had settled over long stretches of the siege is broken again. Not gently, but forcefully. The earth itself seems to react. Stone walls that have stood for decades begin to feel pressure once more. Dust rises. Signals flash across defensive positions. The city shifts into full alert. This is what centuries of fortification were designed for. Not peace, but moments like this. The final push is not random. It is structured, coordinated, large in scale. Ottoman forces commit significant resources, attempting to overwhelm the defenses through concentrated pressure. Cannons fire in repeated sequences. Infantry movements increase. Positions tighten around key areas of the city. The strategy is clear. Apply maximum force. Test every weakness. Break the endurance that has held for so long. Inside Candia, the response is immediate. Venetian defenders move with urgency that only comes when time stops feeling slow. Soldiers take positions along the walls. Artillery crews prepare counterfire. Engineers rush to repair damage as it appears. Every section of the fortifications becomes active at once. There is no quiet area anymore, only different levels of noise. The siege, which had sometimes felt like a slow rhythm of waiting, now becomes something sharper, faster, more intense, but still controlled. Because even in chaos, structure remains. Commanders know that this moment has been expected for years. Maybe not this exact timing, but this kind of escalation. And so the defenses hold their discipline. Cannons respond. Walls are reinforced under pressure. Teams rotate carefully to avoid exhaustion in the middle of battle. Even after decades, training and structure still matter. Outside the city, Ottoman forces push harder. This is not a casual engagement. It is a concentrated effort built on long preparation. Troops advance in coordinated movements. Artillery continues firing in sustained patterns. The goal is clear. Create openings. Force reactions. Find weak points that have developed over time. But Candia is not the same city it was at the beginning of the siege. It has been reinforced again and again, improved through years of experience, strengthened by both necessity and international support. The walls are not just stone anymore. They are layers of effort, time, repair, and human endurance. As the bombardment continues, the sound becomes part of everything. It is no longer surprising. It is constant, like weather that refuses to change. Inside the city, civilians adapt quickly once again. This is something they have learned over years. When intensity rises, routine becomes even more important. People still move through their essential tasks, not ignoring the battle, but living alongside it. Markets operate in limited ways. Food is distributed carefully. Families stay close together during the heaviest moments of noise. Children are kept indoors more often, but life does not fully stop. It simply becomes more focused, more careful, more quiet in certain areas. There is a strange discipline that forms in long sieges. People learn what can be controlled and what cannot, and they focus only on what can. Meanwhile, the final push continues to escalate. Cannons fire in waves. Some sections of the walls absorb impact after impact. Smoke rises across the battlefield. Signals and messages move rapidly between commanders. Every decision now carries greater weight. Because this is the phase where sieges are decided, not always by one moment, but by accumulated pressure reaching its limit. Inside Candia, defenders feel that weight too. Fatigue from years of conflict is still present, but it is replaced in this moment by focus. Adrenaline returns in a way that only immediate danger can create. Every person on the walls knows their role. Every position matters. Every repair must happen quickly. There is no time for hesitation, and yet even in this intensity, something familiar remains. Routine. War has become routine here. Even the final push fits into patterns that have been learned over decades. Attack, defend, repair, hold, repeat. Outside, Ottoman forces continue their effort, pressing forward with determination, shaped by years of preparation and frustration. Inside, Venetian defenders respond with equal determination, shaped by years of survival and adaptation. The Mediterranean watches silently around them, as it always has, unchanged by the intensity unfolding on its shores. As the day continues, both sides understand something without saying it out loud. This push will not end quickly. Even if it is called final, even if it is large in scale, even if it is carefully planned. The city has survived too long. The defenses are too strong. The conflict is too deep. But still, this moment matters, because it represents the peak of long patience, the point where waiting ends and action takes full control. And as cannons continue to roar across the landscape, Candia stands once again in the center of history. Not as a quiet fortress, not as a passive target, but as a city under its greatest pressure yet, holding, resisting, and watching as the longest siege in history enters one of its most intense chapters yet. After 21 long years, something almost unbelievable finally happens. The siege of Candia comes to an end, not with one dramatic explosion, not with a single heroic last stand, but with something far more human: exhaustion and agreement. By 1669, the city of Candia has been under pressure for so long that time itself feels different. People no longer talk about when will this end with hope. They talk about it like a question that has no easy answer anymore, because after 2 decades of war, everyone involved understands a simple truth. Even strong walls cannot fight forever. Even strong armies cannot attack forever. And even strong empires eventually reach their limits. Inside the city, life has become a careful balance between survival and fatigue. Outside the walls, the Ottoman forces continue their presence, but even they are no longer operating with the same endless energy that existed in the beginning. This is what 21 years of siege does. It does not just test cities, it tests everyone. The final phase of the siege is not sudden, it is slow, heavy, almost quiet in its own way. The cannons still exist, but their rhythm has changed. The attacks are less about breakthrough now, and more about pressure, a reminder that the situation has no easy escape. Inside Candia, the Venetian defenders are still holding positions, still repairing walls, still maintaining order, but everything feels stretched, like a rope pulled too long for too many years. Even discipline starts to feel like effort instead of routine. Soldiers who once arrived young now carry the exhaustion of entire lifetimes. Some have spent more years inside the siege than outside of it. For them, Candia is not a battlefield anymore. It is simply the only world they know. And outside that world, there is only imagination. Food supplies are low, reinforcements are rare, and the sea, once a lifeline, is no longer enough to fully change the situation. The Republic of Venice continues to support the city, but the cost of doing so has become enormous. Ships have been lost, resources stretched, attention divided across many fronts. After so many years, even strong support begins to feel like strain. And so, slowly, the idea of ending the siege begins to grow. Not as surrender, not as defeat in the traditional sense, but as a recognition of reality. That this cannot continue forever. Negotiations begin quietly. Not loud declarations, not public announcements, but careful discussions. Messages carried between commanders. Terms slowly shaped over time. Conditions debated, adjusted, reconsidered. Because ending a 21-year siege is not simple. It is not just a military decision. It is political, emotional, strategic, and deeply human. Inside Candia, civilians sense the change before they fully understand it. The intensity of battle remains in the background, but something different appears in conversations. A new tone, less urgency, more waiting, more watching. People begin to notice that decisions are being made at higher levels that do not immediately involve daily defense. And then, slowly, word spreads. Talk of ending the siege, talk of withdrawal, talk of transfer. At first it sounds impossible. After so many years, how can it simply end? But history does not always end with drama. Sometimes it ends with agreement. Eventually, terms are finalized. Candia will be surrendered. The long siege will conclude, and control of Crete will transition from Venetian hands to Ottoman rule. It is not a moment of celebration for everyone. Not a moment of victory for both sides, but it is a moment of closure. After 21 years of endurance, Both sides accept what time has already made clear. The situation has reached its limit. There is no more strategic value in continuing at the same scale. No more energy left for endless escalation. And so, the decision is made. When the final arrangements are carried out, there is no single dramatic fall, no final heroic charge, no cinematic collapse of walls. Instead, there is quiet movement. Orders are given, troops withdraw in stages, positions are handed over, flags change, and the city, after more than 2 decades of resistance, slowly shifts into a new chapter. Inside Candia, emotions are complex. There is sadness, relief, fatigue, confusion, and something harder to name. A feeling that is not quite victory and not quite defeat. More like the end of a very long storm that everyone simply survived. People leave the city in stages. Soldiers pack what they can carry. Families decide what remains and what must be left behind. Streets that were once full of noise become quieter. Not instantly, but gradually. Like a long breath finally being released. The walls of Candia still stand. Strong, impressive, silent. They do not fall. Because they were never truly defeated. They simply witness the end of endurance. Outside, the Ottoman forces take control of the city in an organized transition. Not chaotic, not destructive, structured, controlled. After so many years of conflict, even the ending is careful. Because everyone understands that after such a long siege, destruction is no longer useful. Stability is. As the transition completes, the city begins to settle into a new identity. Different rulers, different systems, different future, but the same geography, the same sea, the same stone walls that still remember everything they have seen. And then finally silence returns. Not the silence of peace, but the silence after something extremely long has ended. The kind of silence that feels unfamiliar at first. Because for more than 2 decades, Candia was never truly quiet. Now it is, and that change feels almost unreal. Looking back, the siege of Candia becomes something larger than just a military event. It becomes a story about time itself, about how long humans can endure, about how slowly conflicts can stretch, and about how endings do not always arrive in dramatic form. Sometimes they arrive quietly, through exhaustion, through agreement, through the simple fact that nothing can continue forever. And so, after 21 years, one of the longest sieges in recorded history finally ends. Not with triumph, not with collapse, but with the world finally deciding it is time to stop. And in that quiet ending, history closes one of its longest chapters, while the sea continues to move. And the city of Candia begins its new life under a different name, a different rule, and a very long memory of what it once survived. When wars end, people often expect something dramatic. A final celebration, a loud moment of victory, a sudden feeling that everything is now normal again. But in Candia, after 21 years of siege, nothing about the ending feels dramatic. It feels quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of quiet that takes time to understand. Because after so many years of cannons, movement, alarms, and constant waiting, silence does not feel peaceful at first. It feels unfamiliar, like the city is still listening for something that is no longer there. Soldiers begin to leave in stages, not all at once, not in a parade, just steady departures, groups packing what remains of their belongings, commands being handed over. Final inspections of positions that once felt permanent. Some soldiers look relieved, some look tired beyond expression. Some do not look back at all, because looking back would make it harder to move forward. Civilians start to rebuild their lives slowly. Not in a grand rebuilding project, but in small actions. Cleaning streets, repairing homes, opening shops again, even if there is not much left to sell at first. Life returns in pieces, carefully, like something fragile, being placed back together after a very long time apart. There is no rush. Nobody is in a hurry anymore. After so many years of urgency, Even normal time feels strange. Inside the city, people walk differently, not because they are afraid anymore, but because they are still adjusting. For over 2 decades, every sound had a meaning, every movement had possible danger, every quiet moment had tension behind it. Now the same streets are just streets again. But the memory of what they were remains. The Republic of Venice no longer governs the city, and the transition of Crete is complete. The island has changed hands, but more importantly, it has changed shape and memory. Empires continue far away from Candia. They rise, they shift, they deal with the new conflicts, new interests, new priorities. Because that is what empires do. They rarely pause for long. They move forward, leaving history behind them in layers. But Candia remains where it has always been. By the sea, under the same sky, on the same ground that witnessed everything. What changes is not its location, but its meaning. The city is no longer just a fortress. It is no longer just a battlefield. It becomes something else. A memory shaped in stone. A reminder of how long time can stretch when people refuse to give up easily. Rebuilding continues slowly. Homes are repaired. Walls are maintained, not for war now, but for structure. Markets begin to function again, even if smaller than before. People rediscover simple routines that were once forgotten under pressure. Buying food without fear, walking without checking every direction, sleeping without the constant expectation of interruption. These things return gradually, not all at once, and not perfectly. Some habits from the siege remain. People still look toward the sea sometimes, expecting movement that is no longer there. They still listen for sounds that used to mean danger. They still measure time in ways shaped by survival. Because 21 years does not disappear quickly from memory. Children who grew up during the siege now become adults in a city that is no longer under threat. For them, the past feels like a story they lived inside, not something distant, something personal. They remember nights of waiting, days of limited supplies, moments of uncertainty that shaped how they understand stability. And now they are learning a different kind of life, one without constant pressure, one where tomorrow is not a question mark. Some find this new life strange, too quiet, too open, as if something important is missing. But slowly, that feeling softens. Because peace, like war, also takes time to understand. The city itself carries visible marks of the long siege, repaired sections of walls, older stone mixed with newer construction, layers of history built directly into its structure. But there is no sense of destruction alone. There is endurance in those stones, a kind of memory that does not fade easily. People begin to tell stories again, not only about survival, but about everything that happened in between. The strange, normal life inside war, the friendships formed under pressure, the small jokes shared during difficult days, the quiet moments of hope that kept people moving forward. Over time, those stories become part of the city's identity, not as tragedy alone, but as experience, as history lived fully, even in hardship. And as the years pass, the siege becomes something else entirely. It becomes a reference point, a lesson, a reminder of how long endurance can last when survival depends on it, but also a reminder that nothing stays the same forever. Not conflict, not empires, not even cities under siege. Everything changes eventually. The Mediterranean continues its rhythm, waves moving as they always have, ships traveling for trade, not war. The horizon no longer carries the same tension it once did. And Candia, though changed, still stands, still alive, still shaped by everything it endured. There is no grand ending speech, no final announcement that closes history neatly. Only time moving forward again, slowly restoring balance, quietly rebuilding normality, and leaving behind a city that understands something very deeply now. That silence after conflict is not empty. It is full of memory, and in that memory, Candia lives on. Not as it was before the siege, not as it was during it, but as something entirely changed. A city shaped not only by walls and wars, but by the long passage of time itself. When people hear about the siege of Candia, lasting 21 years, the first reaction is usually simple: confusion. Because in most cases, sieges are not supposed to last that long. Cities fall, armies win, or someone eventually gives up. But here, none of that happened quickly. So the real question becomes very natural. Why did this siege last so long? And the answer is not one thing. It is many things working together at the same time. Geography, naval power, logistics, politics, and a lot of hesitation on both sides. Let's start with geography. Candia was located on the island of Crete. That already changes everything, because this was not a normal land siege where armies surround a city and block roads. This was a siege on an island, which means water becomes part of the battlefield, and that changes the entire logic of war. On land, if you control the surrounding territory, you slowly choke the city. But on an island, the sea is always there, and the sea does not behave like land. It cannot be fully controlled from one direction. So even when the city was surrounded on land, it still had one lifeline: the sea route, which leads to the second major reason: naval power. This siege was not just about armies, it was about ships. Two major powers were involved: the Republic of Venice and the Ottoman Empire. Both had strong naval capabilities, but neither could completely dominate the Mediterranean in a way that made the siege simple. Venice relied heavily on maritime supply routes. If its ships could reach Candia, the city could survive longer. If they were stopped, pressure increased immediately. The Ottoman Empire understood this clearly, so a large part of the conflict became about controlling sea lanes, not just fighting near the city, but fighting everywhere around it. At sea, control is never absolute. Winds change, storms interfere, ships move unpredictably, and visibility is limited. This makes consistent blockade extremely difficult. So even when one side gained temporary advantage, it was rarely permanent. Which brings us to the third reason: supply chains. Modern thinking often forgets how fragile logistics were in long historical conflicts. Every soldier needed food. Every cannon needed ammunition. Every ship needed maintenance. Every fortress needed materials for repair. And all of that had to travel long distances. For Venice, supplies had to cross the Mediterranean Sea. For the Ottoman Empire, maintaining a long siege required continuous movement of resources across multiple regions. And here is the key point: the longer a siege lasts, the more resources it consumes. Not in a straight line, but exponentially. Small delays create larger delays. One missed shipment affects another. One lost convoy affects entire campaigns. So both sides slowly began to feel the pressure of distance. Even powerful empires are not immune to logistics fatigue. Now we move to political hesitation. This is one of the most important reasons the siege lasted so long. Because wars are not only fought on battlefields, they are also shaped in councils, courts, and governments. Venice did not want to lose Candia, but it also had to balance cost, politics, and other territories. Sending constant reinforcements across the sea was expensive, risky, and politically sensitive. The Ottoman Empire also had multiple priorities across its vast territory. Candia was important, but it was not the only concern, so both sides often found themselves in a situation where full commitment was difficult. Not because they lacked power, but because they had many other responsibilities. This creates a kind of slow war, not weak, but stretched. And when wars become stretched, they last longer than expected. Another factor was military balance. Neither side achieved a complete breakthrough early in the siege. Candia's defenses were extremely strong. Massive fortifications, layered walls, carefully designed structures that could absorb repeated attacks. Every time attackers tried to break through, the defenses adapted. Repairs were made. Weak points were strengthened. New techniques were introduced. At the same time, attackers also adapted. New strategies were tested. New artillery methods were used, but no side found a final solution. This creates a cycle: attack, defend, adapt, repeat. And that cycle is exactly what stretches time. Then there is the human factor. Soldiers on both sides changed frequently. Rotations happened. Commanders were replaced. Experience was gained and lost repeatedly. This prevents quick resolution, because continuity matters in long conflicts. Without it, strategies take longer to develop fully. And then there is disease and exhaustion, not dramatic in appearance, but extremely powerful in effect. Armies weakened, not only from battle, but from long-term conditions. Fatigue reduced efficiency. Illness slowed movement. Morale declined over time. All of this made operations slower and less decisive, which again extended the siege. There is also something psychological. After a certain point, both sides became locked into expectation. Giving up became harder than continuing. Because too much had already been invested, too many years had passed, too many losses had occurred. So instead of stopping, both sides continued. Not always with enthusiasm, but with momentum. And momentum in war is a powerful thing, even when it is slow. So when we combine all these factors, the picture becomes clearer. An island location that makes siege warfare more complex. A maritime battlefield that cannot be fully controlled. Long supply chains stretched across oceans and territories. Political hesitation on both sides due to multiple global priorities. Strong fortifications that resisted repeated attacks. Constant adaptation by defenders and attackers. Human fatigue and rotation reducing efficiency. And psychological commitment that prevented early exit. All of these layers stacked together. And instead of producing a quick result, they produced delay. Years became decades. Decades became history. And that is why the siege of Candia lasted 21 years. Not because one side was weak, but because the system itself was too balanced, too complex, and too stretched for a quick conclusion. In the end, this siege is not just a story of war. It is a story of how long systems can continue without breaking completely. How geography shapes conflict. How supply chains define outcomes. How politics slows decisions. And how human endurance stretches time itself. And when we look back now, the most surprising thing is not just that it lasted so long. It is that it lasted at all. A city on an island, two empires, a sea full of movement, and a conflict that refused to end quickly. That is the real story behind the longest siege in history. Not just endurance, but complexity, and the slow mathematics of time, distance, and decision-making that kept it alive far longer than anyone originally expected.